QuickBooks Pro Desktop 2021. Why use account numbers? Let's get into it with Intuit's QuickBooks Pro Desktop 2021. Why use account numbers? We'll first list a couple reasons for using account numbers, then we'll take a look at them in a bit more detail in the software within QuickBooks. First reason, primary reason that comes to most people's mind, and probably the primary reason for account numbers, is you have more control over the ordering of the accounts. The ordering of the accounts on both the chart of accounts as well as the financials, including balance sheet and income statement. Although you do have more control over the ordering of the accounts, the account numbers do not give you primary control over the ordering of the accounts in general. In other words, in general, the account numbers aren't actually the primary driver of the ordering of the accounts. So what we want to do then is understand what the account numbers can do and giving us more flexibility to order the accounts the way we want them to within the structure of the overall system. And that's really where a lot of people get mixed up as well, is thinking that the account numbers are going to be the primary driver of the ordering of accounts and not seeing how they kind of fit into the full system. So we'll take a look at that in more detail in future presentations. We also could have faster data input, meaning when you input things like forms, invoices, bills, and you enter things into them, accounts, for example, of course, then the account numbers can make that quicker to do. For example, if you're entering a bill and you want to enter the expense account like utilities account, it might be a little bit easier to find the account number. Now, I'm not saying that you're going to memorize all the account numbers. Some people can do that very well. They're good at visualizing account number and tying it to the actual account. I'm not saying that everybody can do that. You probably will remember the name utilities before the account number. But what you can do and what you will do and what normal people, without super memories will do is they'll start to memorize the grouping of accounts. So if I know the expense accounts are in a particular grouping of account numbers, that is well within our memory capabilities to do, especially if we do a lot of data input. So we can start to look at the accounts in a certain group. Maybe we have a certain group of account numbers by location or something like that. And we start to remember the range of numbers that are in there, and then we can kind of make it easier for the data input process in that system as well. If we wanted to create filters or whatnot like that, we can also do that with the use of account numbers, saying that you can only use these particular account numbers in this particular range because those range of account numbers tie out to this kind of location if we needed some kind of restriction such as that. Helps to visualize order of the chart of accounts. So when you're thinking about the chart of accounts, it's useful to know the ordering of the chart of accounts, and we'll get into that in more detail. The account numbers will be grouped typically. They're going to need to be grouped if they're set up well in the same kind of systematic order so that we can start to think of the chart of accounts as lining up to the account numbers, and that'll help us visualize kind of the order of the chart of accounts. And that gives you a much better understanding of the accounting process in general. We'll talk about that in more detail once we start to add them. Can make year-end and tax financial work easier. So when you do the year-end work, which is tax work, or possibly you're doing financial, compiling financial statements, or you're working with a CPA firm that is doing that for you, if they're exporting your data and comparing it to the prior year's data, it's a whole lot easier to compare what you did this year to last year, especially if someone added a whole bunch of accounts. If there's account numbers, it's a lot easier to find the account numbers that have been added as opposed to just accounts that are ordered in alphabetical order. It's also more professional, so when you work at a larger company, they're basically going to use account numbers, and they might need account number usage in order to do more filtering options and things like that. So it's good practice just to basically be using account numbers if you're working in the field of accounting. We're now in the QuickBooks example file here. We currently have the open windows open. You can open the open windows by going to the view dropdown, selecting the open windows list. Let's take a look at a few of these things in a little bit of detail. We'll expand more on them in future presentations. But first, let's open our chart of accounts by going to the lists dropdown, chart of accounts. Here's our chart of accounts. We currently have the account numbers on, and this account numbers can give us, like we say, a little bit more control over the ordering that will appear in the chart of accounts. So you can see the account numbers on the left, and if you were to look at this just basically on first glance, you would say, hey, this thing is driven entirely by the account numbers. It's going, lowest to highest, straight on down for the most part. There are a couple exceptions in this chart of account, and we'll take a look at those and how we might adjust those. But there we have it. But it's not really primarily driven. You want the chart of account primarily driven by type. So it's really driven by type over here because you want to start thinking about the chart of accounts as basically type. by type. And the type I would first think about in the most general format as basically the balance sheet on top of the income statement, meaning, or even you might think about it in the most general format, the balance sheet, assets equal liabilities plus equity. Then you break out the income statement, which is part of equity, assets, liabilities, equity on the balance sheet, and then income statement accounts, income and expense accounts. And then we'll break those even further down into their details about current asset types, and the types are broken out to have special needs within QuickBooks. So then this is really what's driving it, and then the account numbers are kind of secondary to that. So then, in other words, if you were to look at the chart of accounts over here, you'd say, well, what if I had a situation like the expenses down here where I have a whole lot of expenses? That's when you have a lot more play with the account numbers. The account numbers have a lot more control now, because now if you didn't have account numbers, they'd be grouped basically within alphabetical order within all these expenses. So this would be the primary categorization, expenses, secondary account numbers, or the alphabetical order. So this is really one of the major categories in the expenses, where the account numbers gives you a lot more control to order the account numbers the way you would like to within this section. Now, if you see the account numbers, let's say on the profit and loss report, reports drop down, company and financial, let's take a look at the profit and loss standard. We have our account numbers down here. It looks like the account numbers here basically line up as the way they set it up here to the alphabetical order as well, but we also see that these subgroups are helping us out. So we have this subgroup, and within say the subgroup of payroll, if I was to open up the payroll, then the alphabetical order is going to be taking effect within there as well. So within payroll, let's just take a look at that one. We've got the gross wages, the payroll taxes, the FUTA tax, and then the SUTA tax. If I was going to go to the edit up top, preferences, and then go to the accounting and company, and then I say I'm going to remove the account numbers and say OK, then within that payroll section, you can see it got kind of regrouped here, where we have now the FUTAs on top as opposed to the gross pay, which it makes more sense to have the gross pay on top, but FUTA starts with an F and gross pay starts with a G, and so it's going to be in a different order. So it looks like they basically put the account numbers on top of the alphabetical order and kind of formatting for the major groupings. But you can see that if you wanted, say, automobiles not on the top here, you couldn't do it without account numbers, and maybe you don't want that $81. Maybe you want that somewhere lower on the chart of accounts. You have that flexibility to do so with the account numbers. So if I turn them back on, edit, preferences, and then accounting, company, and preferences, chart of accounts, and OK. So we'll get into that a little bit more detail in future presentations. Let's go to the home page now and just think about the data input process. So if I think about the data input, I can say, like let's say I'm entering a bill into the system, and it doesn't memorize the bill, and I'm trying to figure out the expense account that's going to be going down here. Well, if I know it's going to be an expense account and I know kind of the range, I can then start to say, well, I think it begins with a 6, right? And then it'll go down here at least to the 6s. If I know that automobile expenses happen to be in the 601 area, then that'll group them here, and then I can go into the further categorization down below that item. So I have the flexibility of either typing in automobile expense, right? Or I have the flexibility of typing in, I know it's in the 601 category, and that'll help me to kind of zero in on these items. So most people, like we say, won't remember the full account number. You're not going to know the full account number, but you might start to see groupings. You might start to say, I can kind of see that if it's a loan, a liability, it's going to start with a 2 up here. And so you'll start to see these numbers as to where they lie in the chart of accounts, more than looking over here in the account type, which is given the list of accounts by account type. So the data input does actually get faster, and it allows you to visualize, the chart of accounts as you're entering the data. And that's going to be the point. It's going to allow you to visualize basically this chart of accounts. And if you can do so, once you start to think about this chart of accounts and basically visualize the order, it looks like when it goes from like just a list that you can't picture to something that at least has some kind of grouping to it, then it's a lot easier to see what's going on, because this lines up to basically the balance sheet on top of the income statement, right? It's the major financial statements are including, the account order here. So also, if you were to basically do financial statements with year-end data, the account numbers can be a lot easier as well, because oftentimes the accountant, when they take your information, especially if they're doing financial work, they're going to take your data from this year, and if they do your books again next year, then they may need to compare this year to next year. So typically they'll do that with the reports, accounting and taxes, and like a trial balance, which is basically the balance sheet on top of the income statement. Now, if I was to export this, say, to Excel, and I had it this year, and then we had your books next year, and I wanted to export your chart of accounts as of the second year end to the same system and compare this chart of accounts to the prior year. I want to line them up side by side, do a comparison. If you added a whole bunch of accounts, if we added a whole bunch of accounts down here, then we have to add that to our system in order to do the comparison. Because if I export this trial balance, it's not going to line up to the trial balance from last year if accounts have been added. So I'm going to have to add the accounts. We're going to have to do that no matter what. But to add the accounts is a lot easier if there's account numbers, rather than just having the account show up by basically alphabetical order. If it shows up by alphabetical order, we got to hunt around a bit more. If you compare a trial balance such as this for the current year and the following year, and you have account numbers, then it's going to be a lot easier. And even if you don't add like account numbers to the chart of accounts, even if you just had accounts that were already there, but you just didn't use them last year, and now you used them this year, they're going to appear, and we're going to have to add them when you do basically that comparison. So it could be, if you're doing financial statements and you're working with a CPA firm, the account numbers can be a lot easier to compare 1 year's trial balance to the prior year trial balance and add any new activity in a particular account or accounts that have been added in total to the system.